And thanks a lot for having me here today. It's really a beautiful place, and it's actually a very nice gathering. I see a lot of different people from different walks of life. So as Curtis mentioned, I just wanted to give a little bit of what we're trying to do. The World Bank is currently preparing a flagship report on Sub-Saharan Africa's urbanization. And as some of you may know, we are very big now on jobs. So we're trying to look at how can we leverage this rapid urbanization in Sub-Saharan Africa for better economic growth and jobs? So let me see. Okay. All right. Okay, so it's a little bit, I think. Okay, it's a little bit different. Okay, so today I just wanted to cover four topics. One is the overall urbanization trends in Sub-Saharan Africa that a lot of you probably know better than I. And then secondly, about the economic performance of the cities. And then thirdly, what is the role of urban governance, institutions, and finance, right, in driving economic growth and jobs? And finally, how can we adapt some of the policy recommendations to evolving urban contexts? So this is, we all like a lot of data at the World Bank. This is just to show that, this Sub-Saharan Africa is urbanizing at breakneck speed. If you can see the blue line on the left-hand side, you can see from between 1975 and 2025, in 50 years, the urban population grew from 170 to 912 million people. That's a five-fold increase, right? And also the population in cities has grown from 64 to 502 million people. What's probably more important is that we know that the urban and city population in the region will double in the next 25 years, if not less. And the right-hand side, the bar chart basically shows these are some of the regions. EAP stands for East Asia and Pacific. ECA is Eastern Europe and Central Asia, North America and Canada, Latin America, South Asia, Middle East, North Africa, and then Sub-Saharan Africa. So, for example, in EAP, East Asia and Pacific, for their cities to double in population size, it's going to take them another 409 years. Whereas in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's going to be less than 23 years, the population is going to double. So this is why there's an urgency, right, of how do we make sure that we can accommodate these young people coming to urban cities in terms of jobs, land, housing, services. I just also wanted to share with you that almost 40% of the people in the region currently live in cities, right? And these are mostly in larger cities, but also in small, medium. What's actually more striking from our perspective is that over 30% of the people are living in city peripheries and towns. So when we talk about urbanization, we tend to focus only on cities. But now we're seeing that these peripheries that are contiguous to cities are growing really fast. And also the smaller towns, the isolated smaller towns are also growing quickly. And so we need to really think about not only cities when we talk about urbanization, but also about peripheries and isolated towns. Yeah, okay. All right. And as we all know, the urban population is also very young, who are in need of more and better jobs. So, for example, SSA, Sub-Saharan Africa, the median age at the moment is 18 years old. And even by 2050, it would still be 23.7 years old. And when you look at the sub-regional breakdown, you can also see that Central Africa, the median age right now is 16 years old. In 25 years, it'll be about 20. So right now, about an estimated 70% of all of the Sub-Saharan Africa's population is under the age of 20. And we need to create 15 million new jobs every year in order to absorb these people. And it's no wonder, right, that we see a lot of Gen Z protests who are frustrated about lack of economic opportunities. If we don't act quickly, I think it's going to be very difficult going forward. Now, we also, in the flagship report, we also looked at how are the Sub-Saharan African cities doing in terms of economic performance, given that cities most of the time generate about 70 to 80% of the GDP in a given country. A lot of the jobs are going to be in urban areas. Now, we compared the per capita GDP that cities generate between Sub-Saharan Africa and East and Pacific. The orange dots are those of Sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see that despite this urbanization, the rate of urban population growing, the GDP per capita has not grown. It actually goes up and down, up and down. Whereas you can see for East Asia and Pacific, the GDP per capita grew exponentially, right, between 1975 and 2020. That's because the structural, economic structural change, transformation has taken place in EAP, East Asia and Pacific, and it hasn't for various reasons in Sub-Saharan Africa. We also what we call the global frontier analysis. This is basically trying to take cities of similar population size across the globe. So we took about it, the analysis is based on a global sample of over 11,000 cities, of which about 1,600 are from Sub-Saharan Africa. So the black line is basically the maximum predicted economic performance of a city of the similar size, right? And then the dots are what the city's economic performance is at the moment. The smaller the gap between the black line and the dots is the smaller the gap between the economic performance. But you can see that a lot of the Sub-Saharan African cities lag other cities in yellow and blue, right? Because the red are the Sub-Saharan African cities. You can see that their economic performance lags, which means that the productivity of these cities also are lagging. And this is a little more numerical. So we also looked at different regions again. Sub-Saharan Africa is almost minus 50. That means that the cities in this region, they have almost 50% lower economic activity compared to this global frontier. And you can see that Eastern Europe and Central Asia is minus 17%, so that's the lowest. Now, if we break down into sub-regions, you can see that cities in Central Africa lag the most in terms of productivity or economic performance. They are about 62.4% lower than what they could otherwise be, whereas Southern Africa is doing much better in terms of economic performance. Okay, so we really need to get these cities going. We want to leverage urbanization, right, to generate more productivity and more and better jobs. So now in our chapter, we're looking at what then is the role of urban governance, institutions, and finance in order to drive this. So needless to say, effective governance is the backbone of economic growth, right? And while this region has really made a lot of progress in terms of improving urban governance, it's introduced a lot of governance reforms. It has been struggling a little bit in terms of implementation. And even though we know that over 70% of the jobs are in the informal sector at the moment, we also know empirically that these informal sector jobs are not very productive, right? And they're not good quality. A lot of them, most of them are in family businesses or self-employed. And over the life cycle, we know that these informal enterprises do not grow. So that means that they cannot employ more people. So in the longer run, we do need to improve, we need to scale medium to large firms that currently only employ 24% of the population. So how do we then try to attract more private investments, more bigger, larger firms? And that, in our analysis, depends on three things. One is this what we call the foundational infrastructure, so what we call the economic infrastructure, digital connectivity, but also physical connectivity and skills. The second is better business environment, so ease of doing business, and that also includes better land and property administration system. And thirdly, institutional capacity, where the firms don't need to get involved in rent-seeking behavior, where they need to pay bribes to get their licenses or permits approved quickly. We also looked at, at the higher level, we also see how that the progress of governance performance in the region hasn't really improved over the decade, right? So here we look at voice and accountability, governance effectiveness, regulatory quality, and the control of corruption. And unfortunately, we see that Sub-Saharan Africa lag on all four indicators, but I think what's a little more concerning is that the performance has actually declined between 2010 and 2023. So we then look at, okay, what can we do? We talk about decentralization, and this continent that has progressed a lot in terms of implementing different types of decentralization. And here, this is where decentralization is a little bit obviously beyond the remit of the city or local governments. This is where the national governments have an important role to play. And decentralization policies, which include political, administrative, and fiscal, are really critical, right, to empower local governments. However, we also know that at the implementation level, it ranges from still highly centralized system to fully devolved models like in South Africa or Kenya. We also know that a lot of countries have quite good decentralization policies on paper, right? But then the implementation is a bit of a problem. So there's a huge gap between de jure decentralization and de facto. And this is obviously because, there's a lot of political economy involved. A lot of the central governments are wary of relinquishing authorities and power to local governments. So it's not easy, to delegate everything or devolve powers. And some countries like Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda have actually re-centralized some powers and functions for political reasons. We also wanted to note that decentralization alone is not a silver bullet, right? We tend to talk about, well, we need to decentralize, but decentralization is only effective when supported by competent institutions and adequate resources. We cannot just decentralize and hope for the best. So then we also looked at, okay, so at the city level, what are the key binding challenges? And we found, or we think, and please correct me if I'm wrong if you guys practitioners have different views on this. We think three things are really key. One is the capability, which is, we didn't call it capacity because we feel like it's a little bit bigger than capacity, but technical, managerial, and institutional capacities. And then resources, right? People do really need more sufficient and predictable financing and funding that, for key urban infrastructure and services. And here, I wanted to make a point about financing and funding. I think we tend to focus, or the local governments tend to focus a lot on the financing side. Financing is the money that you mobilize upfront, right, to invest in certain things. But funding is equally, if not more important. Funding is the money that you use to repay that whatever the debt or whatever you mobilized. And this is critically important in this region especially, because the debt to GDP ratio on average is now about 50%. So we cannot continue to raise financing without securing sufficient funding. And the third bucket of challenges is about accountability. So how do we strengthen accountability of the local governments so that private investors feel confident enough, right, to come in and not have to face exploitation or unfair policy and regulations. So here we came up again with some recommendations. And of course, it's not easy, right, to come up with it's not a one size fits all. We understand that this continent has huge variation in terms of contexts, sizes, characteristics, levels of development across countries and cities. Having said that, we also felt that perhaps there were certain very core recommendations that each government can prioritize. We also didn't want to come up with like a laundry list of recommendations, right? Because there would be like 1,000 recommendations of what needs to be done. But we wanted to come up with very realistic and good enough things that the governments should prioritize. And here, under capability, we thought two things would be quite important: strengthen capacity, which is a no-brainer, and then improving vertical and horizontal coordination or interjurisdictional coordination. For the capacity, for smaller cities and growing peripheries or urbanizing towns, they just really need to focus on, strengthening very essential skills on urban planning, financial and administrative skills. For growing peripheries that I showed you, it would be really important to strengthen the kind of the land use planning, and service delivery for anticipated population and urban growth. For larger cities, it's really important that we see that larger cities are merging or absorbing adjacent towns, and they're forming like a linear kind of how do you say it? It's like a city, but they're kind of merging. So it's for larger cities, it's particularly important to focus on interjurisdictional coordination, planning, investments, urban infrastructure investments. On the resource side, we feel that it's really important for local governments to focus on increasing their own source revenues, particularly through land-based financing. And we feel that the urban land is obviously the most critical asset each urban government has, but not enough is being taken advantage of. And this is because there is a lot of complexity in the land and property administration. So this is one thing that we feel strongly that each local government should prioritize. Having said that, no urban local governments are going to have enough OSRs, own source revenues, right, to be able to cover their own expenses. So we need a much more transparent, consistent, and formula-based equitable intergovernmental fiscal transfers. We understand that a lot of the countries already do have government fiscal transfers. The problem is that it's not regular, it's not consistent, it's a little bit unclear how the amounts are being determined, and most of the time it's through political patronage that is being determined. So that needs to be a lot more transparent and constant. Under accountability, again, two things. One is to link these intergovernmental fiscal transfers with performance-based grants, right? So that we incentivize local governments to change their behaviors and implement some of the difficult reforms. And then try to also foster some transparency by introducing like participatory planning or budgeting, and enhance transparency and try to garner some trust in the system. And in the chapter, we also looked at, instead of looking at different regions, we also we understand and appreciate that there are good examples in the region. And even though there is a lot of variation in the region, we felt that some of the good examples from the region might be easier to emulate for other cities in the region. Of course, they're not perfect, but I think there's some lessons, right, that can be taken away. So for example, for strengthening capability, and some of you might be from Uganda, and some of you may know, the president created the Kampala Capital City Authority at the president's instruction. And this KCCA was given the vast authority. They were able to recruit staff at market-based salaries and very competitively. And also they were given a lot of leeway, in raising their own revenues. So that led to a lot of visible improvements in infrastructure and service delivery. It reduced corruption, it enhanced transparency, and increased revenue collection. Now, of course, there was a trade-off. Having, by sidelining the mayor that was being directly elected, this KCCA had the blessing of the president, so they enjoyed a lot of the privileges that led to a lot of improved outcomes, but it meant that, it meant a little bit of recentralization at the cost of decentralization. So again, we're not suggesting that every government should copy what happened in Kampala, but maybe some of the elements could be picked up. The other example that we also felt was good in terms of interjurisdictional coordination was this Lagos Platform for Development in Nigeria that the bank also supported. So it was a multi-sector platform where a lot of different stakeholders came together, including the government, World Bank Development, IFIs, and private sector, to come up to diagnose constraints, create, prioritize sequence reforms, pipeline, and they came up with pipeline of coordinated projects. And some of the results have been quite promising. There have been improvements in efficiency and effectiveness. There's been more integrated planning and service delivery and evidence-based decision making. And as a result, there's also been a lot of PPP finance that's been leveraged. They've managed to mobilize, for example, $50 million for transport and water sector investments. And the third example, and we have looked at a lot of other different examples from secondary cities as well that I would not go into. But another one we looked at for resources was the property tax reform in Freetown in Sierra Leone. And again, some of you might be aware of this, but they introduced a very simple points-based valuation model, automated billing and tax collection systems, and leveraged the satellite imagery and kind of this participatory data collection to register properties. And as a result, within 2 years, the number of registered properties more than doubled. And some of the success factors are quite relevant. One is that they really adopted a very simplified, locally appropriate valuation method. They also used cheap digital technology, GIS tools, and low-cost data collection that allowed the full city coverage. And then they also brought in private sector to do like the printing and delivering of the tax bills so that there was a little bit of neutrality, independence. And it was also just important to note that the mayor of Freetown embarked on this reform as soon as he came into office, when there was a lot of political support for reform. So again, it's not, these examples are not just about the technical reforms, but also about how do you read the political economy and try to take advantage of this window of opportunity. And then lastly, I think I won't go into too much detail, but we try to calibrate some of the policy priority actions depending on the types of urban areas. So here we have 3 buckets, again, of capability, resources, and accountability. And we try to break down into what are some of the priority actions for large cities, medium-sized, small cities, as opposed to urbanizing towns and growing peripheries. So just for the sake of time, I wouldn't go into the details. I'm happy to discuss a bit later. But we, again, try to prioritize some of the measures on the resources and also accountability. So I'll just stop here and happy to take any questions later on. Thank you.